How's it going?
Good, how about you?
Thanks for coming and speaking. We
Yeah, of course, I'm
appreciate
so
it.
excited.
Yeah. Um, I was hoping, because I was like, is this the same link as the other one? But it worked out. Jeff, are we live? Are we going? We were on already. Okay. So welcome to our next wonderful session here at the RNE Virtual Conference. The next session is about advocacy at any age. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Taylor Kane. Taylor is the founder and president of Remember the Girls, an international nonprofit that unites, educates, and empowers female carriers of X-linked genetic disorders. She founded a campaign called YAC Young ALD Carriers to support young females who carry the gene for ALD and to assist them in positive change through advocacy, social media, and the legislative process. She started the group after her father died from the rare X-linked disorder, ALD, and learned that she was a carrier herself. Taylor has helped raise money for ALD research and lobbied the New Jersey legislator and governor to enact a law requiring the screening of newborns for ADL or ALD. Taylor serves as a leader of the Young Adult Representatives of the Rare Disease Legislative Advocates, YAR. She's also a recent summa cum laude graduate from the George Washington University. She's published a memoir, Rare Like Us, From Losing My Dad to Finding Myself in a Family Plagued by Genetic Disease. Thank you, Taylor. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Tasha. So I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Awesome. All right, how's everything? Is everything looking good? Great. All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Happy afternoon, everyone. My name is Taylor. I'm 22-year-old young adult patient advocate, and I've been involved in advocacy some capacity for most of my life. So I'm a very, very passionate believer that advocacy does not, have an age minimum, does not have an age maximum. I think that people can be advocates long before they can even drive a car. So that's a message I'm always trying to push. And really inspire more young people to be involved in advocacy and rather to see age as a limit, to use it as a mobilizing force. So I'm going to start off by telling some more about my story and my background. My rare disease journey began in 2001 when my dad was pretty out of the blue diagnosed with a rare genetic X-linked disease called adrenoleukodystrophy, or ALD for short. Over the span of the next 2 years, he lost the ability to walk, talk, swallow. He developed early onset dementia, and he went into a vegetative state before passing away in 2003. In the pictures, some of these pictures, you can see me feeding my dad in his hospital bed. There's me and my brother with him. My dad was on hospice for a while, and he stayed in our dining room. I'm really glad that, even though he was sick, I still have the memories and the experiences with him, such as those in these pictures. Also, at the time of his diagnosis, the doctors informed our family that since ALD is inherited on the X chromosome, that I was an obligate carrier of the condition, and that I got the gene from my dad. They said that this meant I had a 50% chance of passing the disease down to any children that I had one day. But other than that, there was very little known about carriers at this time. Now it's known that, carriers are not just carriers, they're not just asymptomatic. Many ALD carriers do eventually develop symptoms of the disease. It's thought to be about 80 to 90% of carriers eventually get symptoms. So, that's something that I've had to consider and think about its impact on my life. But back then, I was dealing with the loss of my dad, and having this disease that has like a million letters in the name that no one's ever heard of before. And I definitely felt, really isolated and alone. I think, when you lose someone at such a young age, me being in kindergarten, I was really confused. I was just starting to grasp the concept of losing someone. But even on top of that, I had experienced disease and decay, and now was going through grief. It wasn't for a few years that I met someone else who had lost a parent. So I just felt really different and really alone. It was also in elementary school when my mom told me that I was a carrier of the disease. Um, I don't really remember how I reacted to this at first. Honestly, I just known that I was a carrier for as long as I can remember. My mom had always done a really good job of re-explaining it to me over the years and telling me, what it would mean if I had kids one day, but always explaining that there were options for me. There were ways to have healthy babies if that's something that I wanted to pursue. So my carrier status was, something I'd always grown up with, but not something that I believe had a negative impact on my life. Um, so, around later in elementary school, I went through years of being really quiet about my dad's death, not really wanting anyone to know. I think when you're that young, you just don't want anything that's going to make you stand out. Even if it's a good thing or a bad thing, you just don't want to be different. But towards the end of elementary school, something just kind of changed and clicked in my mind. And, I just really got the urge to start talking about my dad more, to start telling people about ALD, to raise awareness of the disease and money for research. I had met a boy who lived a few towns over from me, who also had ALD, and I met him and I met with his family, and I think that was really one of the first things that made me realize, like, I want to do more to help people with the disease, and I don't want anyone else to go through what my dad and our family had to go through. ALD needs treatment, needs cures. So I started getting more involved with telling my story. Here you can see a picture of me singing. I don't sing anymore, luckily for everyone, but I used to sing songs dedicated to my dad. This was at an event, the Run for ALD, which my mom and dad started before he passed away. We still have the event every year. Unfortunately, this year it had to be canceled, of course, because of COVID. It's now a bowling event, but it's still something that we hold every year in honor of my dad and to continue to raise money. And then on the right, this is a story that I wrote when I was in 5th grade. I randomly one day just decided to write down what had happened to my family. And then I asked one of my teachers in 5th grade if she could read it over for me and edit it. And she encouraged me to send it to a local paper, which, I didn't really think that there would be any response. But about, a few weeks later, they responded. They told me that they wanted to publish my story in the magazine. They came out and took like photos of me and my family. And I think this was really eye-opening for me because, it was like the first time I really realized, like, wow, all I did was, write my story and write what happened to my family. And there's people who care. People want to share this. People think that this is something that they should know. And it's not like I was some scholar. I was 10 years old at the time. Like, I didn't have any special skills. Literally all I did was just write down a few page story. And once the story was published, my mom got contacted by a few other families in New Jersey, that also were impacted by ALD. So that just started broadening the horizons and allowing me to meet more people impacted by ALD, which was amazing. So once I was in middle school and early high school, I think this is really when I started becoming more of an advocate. I say that in quotes because clearly I had been doing advocacy for most of my life, but I hadn't even heard the term advocate until I was like 17 years old. So I had no idea that I was doing advocacy. I had no idea that this was part of a greater thing in a greater community. Like I just thought I was doing what made sense to me in my mind for, the sake of my dad, to honor him and to help other people with ALD. Um, so when I was in the beginning of high school, a newborn screening test was developed for ALD. And so I wrote to some of my state legislators, telling them my story and asking them if they could introduce a bill to add ALD to New Jersey's newborn screening panel. As I'm sure most of you know, every state has a different panel of the diseases that they screen newborns for at birth. But I just thought it was really important for the sake of families in the sake of families in New Jersey to have ALD, on our panel. So you can see here, I'm pictured with some of my legislators in New Jersey. On the right side, this is when I was speaking in front of one of the health committees. And it was a very similar thing, like as when I wrote my article. Like I just went in and basically talked about my story. I talked about my dad, but more importantly, I talked about the boys with ALD that I had met. ALD is usually an early onset disease, and usually affects boys between the ages of 5 and 10. So newborn screening is incredibly important for ALD because, if the disease is found early, they can get a bone marrow transplant or a stem cell transplant or potentially gene therapy. So it's, I talked more about, the importance of finding out early. And I talked about Matthew, which was the boy that I had met a few towns over from me. I told them that if he knew that he had ALD when he was born, the outcome of his life would have been totally different. And then at the very bottom, you can see me with New Jersey's former governor, Chris Christie. I was handing him some information that I compiled on ALD and ALD newborn screening. And fortunately, in 2013, he signed the bill into a law, and New Jersey became one of the first states to require that newborns be screened for ALD. So this was just a great experience looking back. As I said, I had no idea at the time that I was doing advocacy, but this was a really good introduction to, the legislative side of things and seeing how legislation and bills and policies impact people in the rare disease community. So I definitely learned a lot from this experience. Yeah, it's always so funny to me looking back. Like I didn't know that I was really doing, something that so many people in the rare disease community were also doing, in their home states, in their countries. I didn't know that larger community existed, but I'll get to that. So high school, college, and beyond. I continued my advocacy all through high school, college, and beyond, which is pretty much where I'm at now. I graduated in December, so I'm in the beyond right now. But in high school, I really started to think more about my carrier status, and I became really eager to meet other ALD carriers and, to learn more about what it meant for my future. Like I knew that I had a 50% chance of passing it on. I was learning that I could potentially get some symptoms of the condition, but I still felt pretty lonely. The youngest carrier that I knew, other than myself, was my sister, who was 10 years older than me. My half sister Tina. So I was really eager to find other young carriers. So of course, being a Generation Z, I turned to social media. I joined a lot of ALD carrier Facebook groups, but I found that there was not really a place for younger carriers to talk. A lot of carriers find out that they're carriers after already passing the disease down. So many of them are mothers, they're older in their 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. And at that time I was 16. And I felt like the issues that I was thinking about, like, okay, do I tell my boyfriend that I'm a carrier? Like, how do I tell, I thought that my issues were trivial in comparison to what these mothers were going through, a lot of them which had sons with ALD. So I created a group, Young ALD Carriers, or YAC for short, which is specifically for carriers under the age of 30 of ALD. And this was amazing because I really started seeing the power of how social media can bring people all around the world together. I still run that group today. It was also around this time where I just started being more vocal on social media about ALD, about my dad. And it kind of feels like it happened overnight, but then I found out that there was this larger rare disease community that existed, and I learned that there was, over 7,000 of these other rare diseases. I think, when you grow up and you know of your rare disease, like you don't even know what's outside your rare disease bubble. Like I didn't know what the rare disease community was until one day on the internet I found it, basically. And it was amazing meeting other young people who had gone through similar things with me, people I could talk about relationships while being, a carrier of a rare disease or having a rare condition, talking about being in high school, being in college, talking about worrying about symptoms, being pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. Like it was just so eye-opening to start meeting other young people. And by young people, I mean, you know, of course, the young adult group goes from like 16 to 35. I think that there are a lot of differences, of course, between someone who's 16 and someone who's 35. So, starting to meet people who were, 18, 19, 20, like within the same few years as me was amazing. I also met, people that were on the older spectrum of being young, and I've made so many incredible friends. Met first online, but luckily got to meet them at some events like Global Genes and Nord. And they've become really good friends and mentors to me. So it was an incredible experience. Also through that, just starting to learn more about rare diseases and doing research, I found out that there was many other X-linked diseases, as I mentioned, ALD is an X-linked disease, where carriers of these conditions were long thought to be just carriers and be unaffected. However, a lot of them got symptoms. Those symptoms were really under-researched, really poorly understood. There was a lot of gender bias. There was also the difficulty of making reproductive decisions, the psychosocial side effects of being a carrier, worry, guilt, fear, etc. And for a long time, I thought these were just ALD carrier issues. Then I found out that there was all these other X-linked diseases like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, hemophilia A and B, that these women were going through the same exact issues that we were in the rare disease community. We were facing the stigma of being just a carrier when we, in fact, were affected by the condition, both physically and emotionally. So in 2017, my freshman year of college, I formed my nonprofit organization, Remember the Girls, which is the first and only organization that is dedicated to carriers of X-linked conditions. I still work on, of course, running that today. That's my greatest passion. And I think, talking about my years as an advocate just shows, first off, that advocacy, of course, can be done at any age. That advocacy evolves over time. My advocacy started as singing, basically singing stories to my dad, and now it's me running a nonprofit and speaking at different conferences. So advocacy is always evolving. But I think the biggest breakthrough in my advocacy journey was social media, and was finding that whole rare disease community and starting to use my voice on that platform, which, of course, we can speak at local events, we can do things in our community, but social media causes an echo that can literally be heard around the world. Social media has really leveled the playing field for advocates of all ages. Honestly, if anything, I think that social media in a lot of ways benefits Generation Z the most, just because we are the digital natives. Like, we know social media better than any other generation does. And I think that as advocates, we can really use that to our advantage. Of course, social media definitely has its downsides, but I think a big part of advocacy is showing that we can use social media for good. We can share our stories, we can encourage people to act, whether that be donating, whether that be watching a video, whether that be reading something. It also allows us to connect with people all over the world. Of course, we're all involved in advocacy groups, and I'm sure that a lot of us have had conversations with advocates, from countries that we would never, probably have the chance to visit in our lifetime. So social media really is that great connector. Of course, social media literally every day is being used more for advocacy. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday people. Um, I think social media is people's first place to turn for a lot of different things. But it is definitely the biggest tool that we as rare disease advocates of all ages have in our arsenal. And even advocates that are on the older side of the spectrum, you don't have to be a social media expert. You know, if you want to be an advocate on social media, just have an account and basically post things that you care about. It's kind of just as simple as that. Of course, it can get a bit more complex if you want it to, but at the end of the day, it's really just creating this online network and to use our voice from anywhere, anywhere in the world, which is the best part of it. So, some advocacy tips and tricks for advocates of all ages. The biggest thing of all is to establish trust and credibility. This can definitely be hard if you are a younger advocate. Even now, even after doing the things I've done, there are definitely still moments when I feel like I'm not taken as seriously as someone who's 27, like who's a few years older than me, just because of my age. But regardless of that, I work every day to establish my credibility and, to ensure that people know that I'm an expert on my experience. You don't have to have some degree to show your credibility, like everyone is an expert on your experience. The second is to develop consistent and genuine content. This is for social media mostly, but also just, in everyday life. Like you want to be consistent with your message. If one day you're, advocating for, say, with the Affordable Care Act and how it affects our disease patients, you want to remain consistent and make sure that your message, carries that weight. Always try to cater to your audience. It's important to share things that you like and care about, but also things that you think that other people will find interesting and compelling as well. And also, of course, to showcase your personality. Social media makes it easy, I think, to hide behind a veil, but it's really important to focus on just being yourself and not pretending to be someone else. So last but not least, before we move on to questions, I just want to say that age is not just a number. I know we hear that all the time. Age is just a number. Age is just a number. Age matters. Age is important. And you can use your age to your advantage, especially if you are a young advocate. Your words and your experiences carry so much weight, even if you might not think they do. Being a young person who goes to events and speaks at events and does things that other young people typically don't do, and you're in a room that mostly you're the youngest person, that matters. Your presence there matters, and definitely remember that. Yeah. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to find me on social media, email me. You can also check out my website. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, just let me know.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor, for sharing your experience and these great tips for everyone. One question. What if someone is not particularly social media savvy? Do you know of any kind of like educational resources or like places to start for those people?
Yeah, honestly, I would probably start using YouTube. Like there are so many basics videos that like can easily explain how to use, like an Instagram post versus an Instagram story. I refer all the time to YouTube. Also, there's so many just resources looking up. Like I use a lot of Hootsuite resources. Those are a little bit more advanced, but for very beginners, I would say just watch YouTube videos, and there's thousands of them explaining how to use every social media site. So
Great. Um, what would you say, what is your advice for someone who was either recently diagnosed or had a family member who was recently diagnosed with a rare disease from your experience?
So for my experience, I would say people's first instinct now in our social media world is to jump online and find people who are in similar situations, which I think is great. But also at the same time, I think it's important to process on your own time what you've been through. I think social media, when you find this community, it's amazing and eye-opening, but even I find myself sometimes, I can talk about my dad, but think just once you talk about something so much, sometimes you forget what's important to you. Like, I think you can kind of come desensitized to it. So I would say definitely find your group, find your people, but make sure that you're taking time for yourself to process, this new diagnosis, and also make sure that you aren't just finding all of your research from social media. Of course, you need to consult with your doctors about everything. Don't just follow things you see on social media. That's a very, very important one.
Yeah, that actually brings up a great point. You talked about gaining trust and kind of credibility. That's an important step. How do you like vet and like know how to like maneuver the credibility of the sources you use?
Yeah, so as far as for Remember the Girls, we have a medical advisory board. So any articles we share or any information, we just pass it through them. But I think always when you approach social media, regardless if it's about rare disease, just make sure you have like a skeptical eye. Obviously, we know that misinformation can be shared, or if someone's sharing something about, an alternative treatment, just make sure to not take everything at face value. You need to do your own research. You need to ask your own doctors. You need to consult with other people, before just blindly following something. But yeah, I would say just ask your doctors or researchers, or you can also, if you know a doctor, like I will email links to like my medical advisory board and be like, is this legit? Like, use the resources you have at your disposal to find out, the accuracy of things you see online.
Great. We have another one here. What advice would you give to another teen who may be shy or nervous about speaking out?
So I was definitely like this at first when I was younger. I know it sounds weird now because I'm like the most extroverted person I know, but I would say that you don't have to share everything about your story if you don't want to. You don't have to go online and make a video. You don't have to go to those extreme points. Like, I think writing is amazing. I think writing a blog post, I think writing, especially if you are more on the shy side and don't necessarily want to do like public speaking, I think writing is amazing. I also think that, you don't have to even write like, oh, this is my story and write everything. You can write about like grief, for example, and you can write about a topic that's impacted you, but not necessarily go into detail. Like, this is why I care about this. Like, you know, yeah, I think that we need to be cognizant of that, the fact that if we are sharing on social media, we have to remember like we may not want all certain information about our lives to be out there. We may not want, certain information about our diagnoses. So yeah, just keep that in mind. But I would say starting off with writing is a great way to just start sharing your thoughts and ideas and experiences.
Yeah, it's a great way to get thoughts down and kind of understand your own thoughts too. One last question here before we wrap up. Now that you're in the great beyond, as you call it, are you doing advocacy work full time or do you have another career as well?
So I guess I do advocacy work full time. I do have two part-time positions for one's for a nonprofit and one's for a company. But for both, they're both involved in rare disease. So I am doing rare disease advocacy at the larger scale. I'm also running Remember the Girls and doing my speaking, but my main hope is yet to be able to be like a patient advocacy consultant, to work for companies to understand the patient voice, and also just keep up with my public speaking and running Remember the Girls, because obviously that's where so much of my passion is. But yeah, I don't see myself ever leaving the rare disease realm ever. So I'm really grateful for the opportunities that I have now to work for these two amazing organizations, and to learn so much and gain great experience. So
Well, you're such a great asset to the community, and we really appreciate you being here and speaking to us.
thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.